Okay, so I'm in Photoshop. I've got this image open, version copy of this. So I'm going to start just by running zero selective color. So again, if you go over to your actions palette and you find your zero selective color, make sure that you select the parent, the very top layer of it. Click on it once to make it active, and then to run the action, it's the little arrow at the very bottom of that palette that's pointing towards the right. If you click on that, it will actually run the action. And again, you guys have seen this happen to me a number of times. When I run the action, I get this solarized version of the image. That's only because the radio button at the bottom of the properties panel for my selective color adjustment layer is set to relative. I'm going to click on absolute. And then I'm going to go to use the drop-down menu to go to my green, to the greens in this, and I'm going to change the property from filling the greens with 100% black ink to dragging that slider all the way to the left-hand side. And what that's now saying to Photoshop is that I want to fill the greens with white ink. Now, if this green was a pure green, this background would go white. But it's not a pure green. I need to make the green more pure. That's what this hue saturation layer is down below it is. So if you click on the hue saturation layer to make it active, you can then use the targeting adjustment tool. That's the little hand up at the very top. You can see right now when we click on the hue saturation layer that the drop-down menu is set to master, meaning that this is going to saturate or desaturate every color. That's not what we want to do. We want to only impact the greens. So again, you click on the targeting adjustment tool, and when you now come over to your image, if it's active, you'll get something that looks like an eyedropper. If you click on that without even moving, you'll notice that this changes to greens. That whole drop-down menu changed from master to greens. You can also see the area of greens that it's actually picked up in here. So it's savvy. It knows where the greens are. If you then click and drag to the right, you will notice that it changes your saturation slider. It actually takes your saturation slider and makes it 100%. So again, I'm saturating the green. I'm making it more closer to a pure green. It isn't still a perfectly pure green, but this is as much as I can saturate it. You can still see I've got contamination in the background, but this is at least far better than where I was without it. So if you turn the eyeball off, this is a massive improvement in building the mask that we're trying to ultimately build. Unlike some of the other images that I've done using that, we can actually saturate this thing completely without worrying about any of the figure, any of the hair actually turning white. If you guys remember, I'm going to show it to you really quickly. You do not need to do this. Just let me show you my version of this really quickly. If I go to session 5 maybe. In this case, I'm going to run the same action on this image. And again, do the same trick. It was that full figured one. I'm going to drag this all the way back. But now, when I go into the edge of this hair right here, if I do the saturation trick, I'm going to use the targeting adjustment tool. As I start to drag this up, look what happens to the hair here. This actually goes whiter than the background, so this is already problematic. So this was a case where I took the saturation up too far. As you start to back it off and bring it down, this hair in here still needs to be darker than my background. So I'm going to come all the way back down. I couldn't do any saturation move in this one at all. I had to come all the way back and have this thing zeroed out in order for it to work, in order for it not to give me a problem with my mask. Whereas with this image, I could crank that green background all the way up. I mean, that part was no problem here. So it's not an all or nothing thing. You've got to really just pay attention to what it is you're trying to do in your image. So I'm trying to bring this part all the way up. That gives me the best that I can sort of get as a beginning, a starting off point. So then I'm going to look at my channels palette and take a look. So the RGB version of it, which is what I'm looking at right now, it's, again, this is a black and white image, but if you look at the red version, you'll actually notice that this gets slightly lighter. Again, right now I've still got the hue saturation layers selected, so you need to actually make sure that you've got the image selected so that you can really see your channels here, the difference in your channels. And you can see when I go to the difference in just the red channel or the RGB channel, whatever, that the RGB channel is a little bit darker. I actually like the more contrasty version of the red channel because I'm trying to separate the image from the background. So I might as well go with one of my channels. There is no difference in the green and blue because this is a black and white image. So the values of the red, green, and blue, those masks are all identical. So it doesn't matter which one you copy. I'm just on the red channel right now. I'm going to make a copy of it by dragging it down to the little icon at the bottom of my channels palette. That's the square with the plus in the middle. It makes a copy of the red copy, and I'm going to double click on that, and I'm just going to call it Knockout. And this is going to be the beginning of my image, or the beginning of my mask. So then I'm going to do exactly what we've done all along. I'm going to go to the eyedropper tool that's up in my tool palette and come down and grab the color sampler tool, not the eyedropper tool at the top, but the color sampler tool. And I'm going to throw down one just on the figure somewhere in the middle of her face, and then another one in this background. But what I want to do is I want to look at the background area here and see, because you can see all this contamination, all that, like, it's this just grayness that's in the background. What I want to do is I want to pick the worst of it. So I'm going to hover over this area. I'm actually even going to boost my point size up from a 3x3 average to a 5x5 to really include more of that gray. As I hover over the lower right hand corner, I can look at my readouts and I'm getting like 210s. If I go to the other side, I get 203s. So that tells me that this other side over here on the left hand side, lower part, is actually darker. So that's where I'm going to drop my point, is right down in here. So I've got a number 2 point that goes right down in there. At this stage of the game, I am going to run levels, Command L to bring up the levels dialog box. And in the levels dialog box, what I can then look at, I need to change my the readouts of my point number 1 and point number 2 so that they both read RGB. So I'm going to click on the eyedropper for my point number 1 and change it to RGB color. I'm going to do the exact same thing for my point number 2 and change it to RGB color. You can see that the figure I don't need to worry about. It is black. It's already at zeros, but the area that's in the background is sort of a, it's not a middle gray, but it's in that quarter tones gray. It's a 204. Yours should be close. It doesn't have to be exact, but it should be close. I'm going to grab my white point slider underneath the histogram and start to drag it towards the middle, watching what's going on in my info palette. I'm going to get close to 255 here, but not quite there. I'm going to go to 250. I'm going to go to my arrow keys now and tap this in slightly till I get to 255. It takes a few taps to get there. When I do that, I actually spot an area here of my face, of the hair right in here, that's actually started to pick up tone now. If you turn off your preview, you'll see that that actually, well, it's still there, but in this case, when you turn preview on, there's areas over here in the hair that I know should be solid black that are not solid black. So the point that I've got, my number 1 point that's in the middle of this face, I can move it if you hover over that number 1 point, because right now it's in a part of the face that is black, but I've got parts of the hair up in here that should be black that are not. So if you hover over the cursor and hold down your shift key, it will actually change to the eyedropper tool, and you can move this number 1 point. And I'm going to bring it up here to the very top to an area that I know is actually got a lot of gray in it that's up here in the top. You could also try this spot that's right down here that's next to sort of like right above her ear. Those places in there, and you can see now this is giving me 2s in here, so I'm going to actually move it down and see if I get a lighter tone in here. Those are also, that's actually 1s now. I'm going to try the area right above her ear. That's actually a 5 now. So the area right above her ear is the lightest of those background tones. And now I'm simply going to grab my black point slider, start to drag it a little bit towards the center, go to my arrow keys because I'm almost at that 0 point anyway. Takes quite a few taps to get that one in. Recheck your foreground. It's still at the background area, it's still at 255. Before I say okay to this, I'm going to move this all out of the way. I want to check the edge quality of the hair, all the feathery hair that's in the top right-hand corner. I want to make sure I haven't gotten too aggressive and screwed that up. So I'm going to use my preview on and off, and actually it's doing a really good job of cleaning all of that out. However, I've still got tone in this very top left-hand corner. I can still see tone up in here. So I am going to zoom back out. I'm going to grab my number 2 point slider, again holding down the shift key, and I'm going to drag it up into the area that's in that top left-hand corner because I still have tone up in there. And you can see once I got that guy up in here, I'm now reading 240s. There was a massive amount of tone up in there. So I'm going to continue to clean this process out. It's much easier to do this using levels than it is using a brush to do this. So I'm going to continue to drag my white point slider towards the center. Again, watching my readout till I get too close to 255. I'm not there quite there yet. I'm going to go to my arrow keys and tap this in. And then again, before I say okay to this, I'm going to take a look and make sure that everything is the way I hope it'll be. I'm going to use my preview on and off. And in the preview and on and off, I lose some of those little fine hairs, but I keep an awfully lot of them. So I'm going to be happy to sacrifice the few little ones that I'm losing up in here. I'm comfortable with that part. So at this stage of the game, I'm going to say okay. So before I move on, I can actually see the catch lights in her eyes are still showing up on this mask. So I'm going to hit the B key to get a brush. I'm going to make sure that this is a completely hard brush so I don't need to worry about any overspray. It's a normal blending mode, 100% opacity, 100% flow, and then hit the X key to make black my background color, and then I'm going to simply paint over the catch lights in her eyes. I want to take a look at anything else that I got going on in here. The only other problem sites that I'm really picking up in here is the collar of her shirt on the left-hand side. And then there's a bunch of fine little hairs that are shooting out that are just really, they're by her neck. They're really ugly. I'm sure they're hair. I don't really know entirely what they are, but I want to get rid of all of that stuff. So I'm going to make my brush medium softness now, so about a 50% softness. I'm going to change the blending mode of my brush from normal down to overlay, so it's a contrast brush that I can actually work with. I'm going to hit the, again, my foreground colors are black and white. I want to make sure that they really are black and white, so I'm just going to hit the D key, which will default them to black and white. White is now my foreground color, which will be fine. I can use that to get rid of just these little hairs that are on the side of her cheek and her neck. I'm just going to paint down that. Again, don't make Photoshop work any harder than it has to work. So there's still a really jagged edge along that side that I'm going to have to take care of and get rid of. But for the time being right now, I'm fine with where things are at. Then there's also right along the edge of the lapel of her shirt, there are those same little weird contaminations in the background. So I'm simply going to click and paint down along that line and get rid of all of the rest of that nasty stuff that's in the background. Finally, I need the shirt itself to be black. You can see that it's actually a light gray there. That's going to pick up a lot of the green from the background, which I don't want. So I'm going to hit the X key to make black my foreground color and simply paint over that once. I'm going to hit it a second time to make sure I've got a good sharp edge there. That part's working out pretty well for me. I've also got some of that same skanky hair that's on the other side just below her earlobe. So I'm going to hit the X key again to get to white to be my foreground color and simply paint that part out. And that part's working pretty good for me right now. So this is the beginning of my mask. I'm feeling pretty good about this. So right now would be a great time to come up and save this work. So I'm going to do a save as. I'm going to throw this on my toss volume. Don't need to rename it. It is a Photoshop file. It is a save as. Everybody needs to then go to their history palette and click on it. Go up to the very top of your history palette and make sure that you have got a small thumbnail that looks like this image that's got a timestamp on it that says 250 something. If you do not have this timestamp, you need to tell me right now. Okay. All right, so we're ready to actually see how well this thing works. Back over in my layers palette, I can throw away the hue saturation. I can throw away the selective color. I can get rid of all of those guys. I hit just the delete key. All it did was get rid of my layer masks. I'm going to get rid of all of that stuff. I'm going to double click on the hand to kick back out. I'm going to then add a a solid color layer on top of this. White was what I asked you to add. So if we come to the adjustment tool icon at the very bottom of our layers palette, click on it, you'll get a flyout menu. Come up to the very top and say solid color. It will actually open up the color picker. You can use the color picker. Again, my foreground colors are defaulting to my dodging and burning colors right now, so that's not going to help me. If I hit the D key at this point, it doesn't help me over here. It actually tries to put in a value for the numbers that are down here are actually values for web-safe colors. And they're done in hex code. So again, this is not what I want to work at. So I'm going to simply type in the R value. So I'm going to click on the R value to type it in and put in 255, hit the tab key, go to my green, 255, hit the tab key, go to my blue, 255, that gives me a pure white, and I'm going to say okay to that. Then I'm going to come back down to my figure image that's at the bottom, and I'm going to make a duplicate of that. Command J will actually make that duplicate. And then I'm going to drag that duplicate above the solid color fill so that I've actually got a background that will be underneath the figure that I'm masking out. When you bring your cursor, when you're dragging that layer that's underneath the solid fill color up to the top, you need to make sure that you get those two cyan, sort of like that cyan-like color at the very top. That tells you that this layer is going to be put above your solid color. So let go, it's actually above my solid color. I'm going to go back to my channels palette. I'm going to hover over the thumbnail of my knockout, hold down the command key and click. That loads it as an active selection. And then I'm going to come back over to my layers palette and make sure that your top layer is highlighted. Mine is. And then I'm going to click on the icon at the very bottom of the layers palette that is the square, the light square with the dark circle in the middle. That is add layer mask. Then realizing that I work in the negative my whole life, always have, it's backwards. So again, with the mask selected, simply hit Command I, or you'll also notice with the background selected in the properties panel, you have an invert button here as well, and it'll do the exact same thing. We just needed to invert it. At this stage of the game, I'm feeling pretty good about where I'm at, so I actually need to do my spill removal. However, my mask is not complete yet. I've got an issue that's running along the side here, and I've got an issue that's running along the other side over here. So feels like I need to choke this to get rid of this really strong line that's sitting on this side. So the first thing I'm going to do is I know that I'm going to actually not have to choke. Yes?
Yeah, my finger is completely dark.
So your layer order is not correct. You've still got both of these channels on. The adjustment layers, you need to get rid of both of those. And then come back over here and go ahead and command click to load that. Good, come back over here and apply it as a layer mask. And then invert that command I. Oops, sorry. Yep, and you're good.
Thank you.
Okay. So, but I've got a smart object, and again, I cannot do smart object. I can't do any destructive move on the smart object. If you click on the smart object and hit the B key to get a brush, you'll notice you get the circle with the slash through it saying you cannot paint on a smart object. So we need to rasterize this smart object, which rasterizing means turn it into a normal layer. It's no longer going to be a smart object. So make sure that you've got the pixel content of that selected. Go up to the layer menu, come down to Smart Objects, down to Rasterize, or go down to rasterize over to smart object. Either way, it's exactly the same thing. You'll notice that little icon goes away, and now when you hit the B key to get a brush tool, it actually will allow you to paint on this. Before we do our choke on this, we actually need to do a snapshot of what our image looks like in history. So over to your history palette, the little camera that sits down at the very bottom, you want to click on that. Did everybody have a new window that opened up that allows you to name this? Did anybody not get this little window? All right, I'm going to hit cancel on mine. If you did not get the little window, go to your history palette. Just across from the history palette is the drop-down menu part. Click on that menu, come down to history options, and make sure you have these three things selected. The first one, create new snapshot, our first snapshot, is by default. However, you need to add this automatically create new snapshot when saving, put a check mark there, and then also show new snapshot dialog by default, a check mark there, and say OK. Now when you click on that little camera, you'll get this dialog box that opens up. To name the snapshot, you want to call this pre-choke. And say OK to that. So now we've got a version of what this image looks like before we actually choke it. So now we can actually do the choke on it. So come over to your layers palette. You're going to select the top layer to make it active, and then you need to select the mask. Make sure that you get those little white brackets around the mask, because that's what we're choking, is the mask. We're not working on the pixel content right now. We're working on the mask. Your first move to actually do a choke is to soften up this edge, because again, what I'm trying to do, take a look at my screen really quickly, what we're trying to do is introduce levels of gray between this white that is the figure and the black that is the background. I'm trying to introduce shades of gray there so that I can then use levels to either make those grays white, which will expand my mask, which is called a spread, or I can make those layers of gray in between black, which will move my mask into the face, which is actually a choke, which is what we're going to ultimately do on this. So I'm going to go back to just looking at my layer mask. So again, with the layer mask selected, up to the filter menu, down to blur, down to Gaussian blur, and the Gaussian blur that we're going to put on here, I'm going to start off around a 2. 2 seems a little thin to me on this. Again, I'm going to go to a 3. 3 feels better for me in terms of what I'm looking to do here. Again, this is something that you just acquire when you start working with this stuff. That's all I can tell you. It's a feeling. It doesn't matter if this goes wrong and it doesn't work for you. Simply go back in history and either blur the mask a little bit more or blur the mask a little bit less. Either way, you'll be fine. I'm only looking at this one side. I'm not concerned about the other side right now. So I'm going to hit it with a blur of 3 pixels. I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. And then I'm going to choke this. Again, working on my layer mask, I'm going to run levels. Command L brings up the levels dialog box. And I'm going to grab my black point slider and start to drag it towards the middle. And what I'm actually saying I want to do here is I want those gray tones that I introduced in the background to actually be black. Now I'm going to continue to push this over pretty hard. I get over pretty hard now. Right now in my case, I've pulled that black point over to a 177. This is telling me I may have over softened this a little bit. We'll see. I'm actually going to grab my white point slider and drag it towards the center right now, which will actually sharpen up that line a little bit. But when I do that, I bring back the worst of that line. It's that whole sort of dark line that I'm trying to get rid of. So I'm going to continue to drag that black point slider over even more. And take a look at this. I'm going to back out a little bit. I'm going to use my preview check mark on here, on and off. Yeah, that feels actually reasonably good to me. It's a pretty serious move in here, but I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. I ended up with a 217 if you're looking for the very same value that I've got in my black point. My white point is staying at 255, and I'm simply going to hit OK. Then immediately do another history snapshot and call this post choke. And say OK to that. Now here's the tricky part. It's sort of hard to see a lot of my history right now because I've got all of these, I've expanded my info palette. So I've got these number ones and that kind of stuff out there. I don't need these anymore. They've done their work. So I'm going to get rid of them really quickly so that I can see a little bit more history. I can hover between my info palette or my channels palette and drag down to show me more history. But again, I don't need these numbers anymore at the top. I might as well get rid of them. So quickly click on the eyedropper tool. Change your sample size back to a 3x3 again, because that's typically where we work. And then if you click on the color sampler tool, there's a clear all button at the very top. You can click on that. It gets rid of those those numbered readouts, the 1 and the 2. Your history palette now is actually deeper, which is what we want in all of this. And then I'm going to come back before I did either the choke or the spread. So if you take a look at your history palette, you can see that there's a delete color sampler, there is a levels, there's a Gaussian blur, and then there's the rasterized smart object. I'm going to go back to the rasterized smart object history state. It actually brings back that problem, but I've got history states now up at the very top of what this image looked like before it was choked and after it was choked, both. So I am going to, again, you do not want to select any of these history states. You want to put the icon, if you look at the very top of your image, when we first opened it up, it's got actually the name of the image. There's a little brush that's sitting right next to the icon, just to the left of it. That is the history state brush. And wherever that brush icon is the history state that will be painted using the history brush. In my case, I'm going to put it down next to the post choke, and then I'm going to select my history brush. The history brush is just below the clone stamp tool in your toolbar. So if you look down to the one that looks like a rubber stamp, right underneath it is the history brush. If you click on this flyout menu, you'll see that you get two types of brushes, a history brush or an art history brush. You want to make sure that you grab the history brush. That's the one that we're going to actually work with on here. It is in normal blending mode, 100% opacity, 100% flow. Click on my drop-down menu. It's rough of 50% hardness. That's fine. It's only going to paint history anyway, so you don't need to worry about too much overspray. I am going to start up at the very top on the lobe of her ear, and I'm actually going to get rid of part of the, you'll see that there's a pretty dark line on there. I'm hoping that this is going to choke all of that out. Make sure that your mask is selected. A lot of times when you go back in history, it will reselect things like the pixel content of that layer, or it might even select a layer that's actually down. It all depends on what history layer that you go back to. But in our case, you just need to make sure that you've actually got the mask is selected, that the icon for your history state is right next to post choke, and then we're going to simply paint a line that runs right along the side of her cheek, and it will get rid of all of that weird looking line. I'm going to zoom down. It's going to be her whole neck. So I'm simply going to go down. That gets rid of it on that side pretty well. Now we can try the other side to see how the choke goes on the other side. Again, I'm going to start up at that sort of upper part of her earlobe where I can see a little bit of a line there. I'm going to click on that part and come across and paint all the way down. It does an okay job of getting rid of that neck part, but you can see it's pretty rough on that edge over there. It's a little bit janky on that part over there, but otherwise it's done exactly what I needed it to do. It's cleaned up the right side really well. The left side needs a little work on it, so I'm going to do the left side right now. I'm going to hit the P key to get the pen tool. I'm actually going to start on the lower part of her earlobe, and I'm going to simply run the pen tool down. And what I'm looking to do is run the pen tool down on the inside of her face, deliberately wanting to cut off that pebbly part of her face. So you can see if you take a look at the line that I'm drawing right down here, I have every intention of using this to get rid of that part, that edge, the skin that's on that side of her face. So I'm going to continue to work my way down here. The side of her neck is also still really kind of pebbly, so I'm actually going to continue that part down here. Then when I get down to the very end, before I go out, out onto her neck, again, I'm stopping. I don't want to touch the lapel of that shirt, although the lapel looks also like it's pretty pebbly. So I'm going to simply come up here to the top and complete my path. So I can now load this path as a selection. So I'm going to go to my path palette. Really quickly, just because I spent the time doing it, I'm going to double click on the work path and I'm going to name it left cheek. And say OK. I'm going to hover over the thumbnail of it and hold down the Command key and click to load that as a selection. I am going to feather this selection because this should be a soft edge back here. This should not actually be a really hard edge. This should be pretty soft back in here. So I'm going to go up to the Select menu, down to Modify, down to Feather, and I'm going to put in a 2-pixel feather. Again, it's an out of focus skin thing, so it should be softer than I probably normally would do. Go back to my Layers palette, make sure you are still working on the layer mask. So I want this area to be hidden. I don't want to see that skin that I've actually selected here. So I need to fill this with black. Black is my background color, so Command Delete will actually fill that. Command D to deselect. Now, it also actually did the weird thing on the bottom of her earlobe because that's actually where I started it. So I'm going to return this mask to my pre-choke state. Again, that mask will still look like, we'll still be able to paint this using history of what it looked like in the pre-choke state. And in the pre-choke state, I didn't have this dig out right here of her lower part of her ear. So I am going to go back to my history brush and I'm simply going to paint that earlobe part back in and I'm good to go right there. So I'm going to double click on the hand and kick back out and I can see that now, again, the whole knockout on her face, that part's great. We're good to go on that. I simply need to remove the spill now. So to do that, I'm going to select the pixel layer itself. I'm going to zoom in to the top left-hand corner. At this stage of the game, I am going to go to my pasteboard just so that I can use my cursors outside of the image. So the F key will actually get you there. And that way, when I hit the brush key, the B key, I can actually use a brush outside of this image, out here on the pasteboard, which allows me to use just the edges to hit the areas of green at the very top of her head that I need to actually fix. So I'm going to make my brush larger. I'm actually going to make it a completely soft brush, so I'm going to drag the hardness all the way down. I'm going to change the blending mode from overlay down to color. 100% opacity, 100% flow, and then I'm just going to hover over a color of her hair so that I can sample a color of her hair to make it my foreground color. Hold down the Option key, I will temporarily get the color sampler tool, click, it gives me a color of hair, and then I'm simply going to start painting over the area of green that's in the hair. Do not come in and paint on anything that does not have spill. Again, you'll end up making the hair just one solid color and it will not look correct. As I start to move down the side of her head, there's a little bit darker hair here, so I'm going to resample another color to be my foreground color by holding down the Option key and get rid of the hair that's right here. When I get really close to her ear, I'm going to zoom in, and at this stage of the game, you need to make your brush 100% hard because you can't afford to overspray hair color onto her ear, which will actually change her ear color. It'll completely desaturate her ear color. I don't want to do that. I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller using the bracket keys. I'm going to then remove the green that's right around that. That part's gone. We've got a little bit more to get to right there. Before we move away from this area, I want to show you another great trick. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. At this stage of the game, I want you to turn off the layer mask that's controlling this. So simply hold down the Shift key and click on the layer mask. It turns it off. And what I'm looking for here is to make sure that I've removed all of the spill from any possible hairs. And look up at my screen here really quickly to see what I'm talking about. You can see that there's hair right here that I have missed. Now, it may not be showing up because of my layer mask, but I'm not going to even chance that. I'm simply going to paint across this area, use on my pixel layer, knowing now that no matter what, I know that all of that hair has been gotten. I haven't like missed anything. There's another area that's right down here below the ear. There's a little bit of fine hair that's sitting down here that also might be outside that I need to make sure that I've gotten that. I know I've gotten rid of the hair that's on this side, so I don't need to worry about that part anymore. Hold down the Shift key and click on my layer mask again. Zip back out. All of the spill on that side has been removed. I need to actually get it on the other side right now. I'm going to go back to a soft brush. I'm going to sample darker hair over here, holding down the Option key and something a little bit darker, make my brush a little bit larger, and remove the spill that's on this side. And go back to a hard brush now so that I don't overspray onto her ear on the left-hand side, and get rid of the rest of the spill that's on that side right there. If you feel like that there is glow on her skin that's actually got green in it, I don't really see green in mine right now, but I know when we were looking at this, when we were talking about the assignments that were turned in, there were some people that felt that there was a little bit of green there. I can see a little bit of green on her skin right down, it's right where her cheek is meeting her neck. So I am going to go after that part, make my brush considerably smaller. Hold down the Option key to sample skin tone and hit just that little edge right there. That takes care of that. And then finally, I need to remove the spill that's on her shirt. So I'm going to hold down the the Option key to sample the inside of her shirt, and then just run that part down to get rid of that. Double click on the hand and then save this work. Up to the Edit menu, down to Save, because we've already saved it once. If you hit the F key, you'll go to the black pasteboard. The F key one more time, you will go to the regular stoplight version of it all. It has saved your file. You want to go up to the very top and make sure now you've got another history state that is time-stamped. I do have one up there, and you are good to go. Are there questions about any of this? You can't do what?
Sample it, it just...
Oh, because you're actually working on your mask. You need to be working on the pixel layer.
Okay.
So you will be happy to know that this is the beginning of one of your homework assignments. And if you did it, you're good to go. If you didn't, you get to do it on your own. Questions about this? All right, you can close this up, but you should definitely save it. This will save you time on your homework, because that's the first part of one of your assignments for your homework. Okay, today's all about frequency separation. How many people in this room have ever used or do or work with frequency separation? One person? Oh, good. That means I've only got one person's bad habits to break. Just kidding, Bree. If you could be the queen of frequency separation, and I would never know it. So, but I'll know it after this next assignment. Okay, so remember last week. So wait a second. First off, how did the tonal retouching go? Okay, wait, because I always want to ask this question. There's only two camps with doing tonal work. There's the people who love it and the people who hate it. So who's in the I hate it camp? Okay, who's in the I love it camp? Okay, anyway, I can't say anything to change that. You either love it or hate it, but there's some people who find it, I always thought that, if you get really fucked up, well, not really fucked up, but slightly fucked up, then the time thing doesn't matter, and you can just sit there mindlessly doing it, and it's okay. But if you're too fucked up, then you lose sight of what you're really trying to do, and you get up the next morning and you look at it and you go, oh my God, what was I thinking? Oh, because I was all fucked up. I shouldn't have done that. So at any rate, there's got to be a happy balance in there somewhere. It's like doing the pen tool. I always wanted it to be able to watch a movie while I did it, but you can't do that. So anyway, if I had some great advice to you, I would give it to you, but there isn't any. But it does an amazing job for what it's for, and you will find uses for it later on as well. But at any rate, remember we had this conversation last week when we were talking about getting into this, that you need to really balance the kind of retouching you do with the project at hand. right? So the example that I was using, you've got a friend who gives you 10 full-length fashion images and says, I got $100, will you retouch these? And you say, sure. And you go in with the healing brush tool and you just smack the shit out of all the skin in it and you're done. Takes you 10 minutes, you get $100 for 10 minutes. I would do that. That's the one version. The other version is that L'Oreal comes to you and says, I've got $20,000 in a month for you to actually do this one image of, you know, who are we going to do? Lady Gaga. Let's make her the new face of L'Oreal. And you say, okay, and then you do tonal retouching on that, right? So those are kind of the two extremes. Frequency separation, in my opinion, falls in the middle. It is nowhere near as difficult and time-consuming as tonal retouching work is, but it is considerably better than whacking at your image using the healing brush or the clone stamp tool. Now, ironically, we use the healing brush tool and the clone stamp tool in doing our frequency work, but because of the way it's constructed, we end up doing far less damage than if we're just working on the normal image. So to understand this part, you have to understand what spatial frequency is. And so that's going to be the first thing that we actually do. I want to point a couple things out to you really fast, just in the resources for you. If we look in, this is our class number 7. If you look inside of your student folder, there is a split frequency folder. It's dedicated to this. There are a couple of PDFs in here that you should actually save because these will give you the recipes for how to do split frequency work. The first is this high pass frequency. No, I take it back. The first one that you should look at is the Ultimate Guide to Split Frequency Technique. This will walk you through a whole bunch of things, but the most important part about what this does is this actually gives you the split recipes. And so there are these things right here. We'll take a look at these in closer detail. Eventually, if you do a lot of work, split frequency work, you will memorize these recipes here, but it's basically how to do the split frequency work in your image. So I just wanted to point out that this exists. There is a non-destructive setup that nobody ever talks about that I think you should use. It's an extension of the recipe that happens down here. If I've completely lost you at this stage of the game, don't worry about it. I will get you back. Then the next one is the mixer brush settings for retouching. These settings apply specifically to doing frequency work. And then there is a second way. There are two methods to actually do split frequency work. One involves apply image, the other involves high pass. I will show you all of these. So I just wanted to point out that there are PDFs about all of this. It's a lot of information. I don't expect you to memorize it right now. These are things that you can refer back to and say, oh, okay, that's how we actually do this version, blah, 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 and you're off to the races. There's also some skin textures and skin brushes in here that hopefully we'll be able to get to today. If not, we will get to them next week. And then finally, there's a set of split frequency images for you to work on. So if you click on the first on the split frequency images to actually open up, the first one I want you to open up is a split frequency retouching image.psd. Again, it's another picture of a girl on a green screen. You guys are probably getting very used to the way I shoot a lot of my work. So anyway, can everybody find this image? Okay, I want you to zoom in close to this girl's eye, or just come into her face pretty closely right here. So what do we mean by spatial frequency? And this is what it really boils down to. If you take a look at her skin, so I'm looking at her skin that's right underneath her eye, you can see it's not the greatest skin in the world, but it's not the worst skin in the world. You can see if we zoom in pretty close right here, there is some variation in this. If I'm taking a look at this and I'm going across her skin, you can see there's some pores in here and textures in here. There's some highlights and shadows in here. As I move my cursor across this, those things will show up. But the truth of it is, the majority of this area of her face is what they call low spatial frequency. And what that means is that there are very subtle to no changes of color and tone in this area. So as we go across it, there's a very consistent color and a very consistent tone. Yeah, there's a little bit of changes in here, not a whole lot though. that would be considered low spatial frequency. Low spatial frequency, you can think of it as color and tone. If we go to the area above that, which is where her eye is, and we look at this area right here, this is a different animal altogether. There is radical shifting of tone and color that's happening really fast in here as well. So if you take a look at the area that represents her lower eyelashes here, there is massive change of color and tone very, very, very rapidly in this. That is what gives us detail. That's what actually shows you eyelashes against skin that's actually got makeup on it. All of those things represent changes. This is an area that we would call high spatial frequency. And the reason it's high frequency is there's rapid changes that are happening extremely fast. So this represents detail in your image. So to get this home back to you, to reinforce this, you will not see this on the video, you will hear it, but just the two things that you need to remember in your life when it comes to doing split frequency work is that high frequency equals detail. Low frequency equals tone and color. And the reason this matters to us is what we're going to do is we are going to take this image and split it into these two things. We are going to have one copy of this image that only deals with detail and another copy that only ends up dealing with tone. Why does that matter? You cannot, there are no retouching tools in Photoshop that respect this difference. So to give you an example of what I mean, I'm going to zip back out, take a look at her lower, I want you to take a look, come in at her mouth. And what I really want you to do is look at this area that's on the side of her cheek, the side of her lip, on the left-hand side here. I want you to take a look at that. And in this area, what you can see is two things. You can see a bunch, well, you can see a lot of things, but you can see a bunch of fine little hairs that are in here. That is detail. That would be all high frequency. But look what's actually underneath it. You can see that because of my lighting is actually coming from the right side of my image to the left side of my image. This is actually in shadow. So there is a shadow that's coming across this area as well. So that is low frequency. The problem that I've got if I use either the healing brush tool or the clone stamp tool, let's say I grab the clone stamp tool and I grab an area that's up here of this image and I use it to clone down here. Well, it will get rid of the fine hairs, but it will also take this skin that's up in this area that's actually back into full light, and it will replace the skin down here, but then the skin that got replaced would be too light. Does that make sense? And the same thing will happen if I try to use this with the healing brush tool. It will not respect the difference in this. So if I can split these two into high frequency and low frequency, the goal would be to be able to retouch all the fine little hairs, but still have the shadowing, the shading of that lip intact. Does that make sense to everyone? All right. So this is how you do it. We're going to start off. Again, there are all the recipes for this because this is pretty involved. So all the recipes exist for this. So just don't get discouraged when I show you this part. It's all laid out in that PDF how you follow this recipe. The one thing that I will say that you need to be aware of, I'm actually going to open this recipe really quickly just so that you make sure that everybody understands where to go to actually look at this. So again, it's in the Ultimate Guide to Frequency Separation Technique. If you zip down here, these are the two versions of this that we're actually going to go through. And let me see. It's these recipes right here. One of these recipes is if you're working in an 8-bit color depth. The other is if you are working in a 16-bit color depth. And this really matters. The two are completely different in how they work. The goal is ultimately the same. The problem in this, not the problem, but the reason that we do this is that in doing split frequency work in 8-bit, there is no true middle gray. Again, I don't want to get too technical in this. I don't want to lose anybody in this. But in 16-bit, the way Photoshop has engineered 16-bit, there is a true middle gray. Some people would say that makes working in 16-bit superior to this. I say it's not worth the hassle, and it's certainly not worth the overhead. The size of your image doubles if you go to 16-bit, and the amount of time it takes for anything to render on that image in Photoshop also doubles. Not worth it to me. So, but at any rate, so far in all the images that I've looked at that you guys have turned in, I don't find there's nobody here that's working solely in 16-bit. If you are, that's fine. It's just that if you are, you need to follow the 16-bit recipe, not the 8-bit one. Are we good on this part? You take a look at your image. So if you take a look here at our image, right up here at the top, see where it says RGB/8? That would be a 16 if you were working in 16-bit. Okay, so we're going to split this image. It is an 8-bit image, and we're going to split it and actually start to do some retouching on it right now. So to split it, your first move is to make 2 copies of your background. So Command J, Command J. Double click on the name, and naming in this becomes really important because we can do multiple splits, and this will start to get to be very confusing what one layer is and what one layer isn't. So make sure that you do name your layers. Again, it will save you heartache in the end. So I'm going to double click on the layer that's in the middle now, and I'm going to call it low. And then I'm going to double click on the layer that's above it, the one on the top, and I'm going to call it high. And this is where I'm going to put my low frequencies and my high frequencies. Everybody good on this part so far? This is something especially, guys, especially if you get lost in a step on this, sing out right away, because if you get lost, there is no hope that you can finish this. So don't let me leave you behind, okay? Got to feel like, Shane, don't, isn't the movie Shane where he's like riding away and the kid's like, Shane, right? Anyway, I'm not going to abandon you. Okay, anyway, select the low layer right now and turn the eyeball off for the high layer. We only want to look at the low layer right now. Now at this stage of the game, I would say you want to come in at about 100%. It's 100%, 200%. It's sort of hard to say where you really need to be in here. I'm actually going to go to a 200%, and I can see a good part of her eye, a good part of her mouth. You'll understand why this is in just a second. So we need to blur this now to get rid of the detail. So to do this, come up to the filter menu, down to blur, down to Gaussian blur. And in the Gaussian blur, it used to be in doing this work that people would say that you always should be doing your split frequency radiuses in increments of 3, meaning you would do either 3 radius, 6 radius, 9 radius, 12 radius, 15 radius, whatever. I've been working in this for a really long time. I used to work that way. I've given up on that. I don't work on that way any longer. There may be a disadvantage in the math behind this, but I've never been able to see it, and I think, again, the upside outweighs the downside. So I'm not going to do that. What I'm simply trying to do here, though, is I want to get enough blur in this image that I lose what I consider to be the detail of this. So I'm going to start back here at a radius of 0.1. I'm going to click it up pretty quick. I'm going to hit it up to a 1. And what I'm really looking at are those little fine hairs that I was just talking to you about. They're still there, so that's not good enough for me. I'm going to go up to a 2 now. I still see them. I'm going to go to a 3 now. They're pretty much gone at that stage of the game. I'm looking around at other things in here, and I'm feeling like I've still got a little bit of detail that's happening up in the hair, and probably still some that's happening in the skin. So I'm going to go to a 4. And again, I'm just picking whole numbers because it's just easy to do. I'm going to go to a 4. Again, you can use your preview check mark here to turn this on and off to see what you feel like you're getting in this and what you're not getting in this. And I'm going to go ahead and stick with a 4. That actually looks like a good compromise to me. You could continue to go higher. This is what you're going to find, though, that happens in this. We're not going to lose anything in this image. We're losing nothing. What we're going to do is, what we're saying right now is that what do you want to be considered tone and color, and what do you want to be considering as detail? Now, in this case, I'm picking the tone and color first. I'm happy with this as tone and color. Everything else is going to be on my detail layer. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK to this. My next move now is to activate the high layer. So I'm going to click on it. I'm going to turn it on. So we've actually established the low frequencies of this image. That's now in my low layer. To give me the high layer, what I'm going to do is right now the high is the total image. This is everything. This is high frequency and low frequency together. What I'm going to do now is subtract the low from this total image, and what I will be left with is the high frequency. So to do that, make sure again that you've got the high layer is active and it's turned on. You come up to the image menu, down to apply image. So again, the majority of you people maybe have never even seen this, much less used this. So again, image menu, down to apply image and let go. A dialog box will actually open up, and we need to set this a very specific way. So in the in the merged version of this, I'm not going to do the merged version of this. I'm actually going to select the low layer. In the drop-down menu here for RGB, I'm going to leave it as RGB. I'm not going to invert this. In the drop-down menu for blending, I'm going to change that from multiply down to subtract. In the scale, I'm going to set that to 2, and in the offset, I'm going to set it to 128. And you should have something that looks somewhat like a high-pass frequency filter image. It should be mostly grays. And then you should see things like those fine little hairs again in the textures of her skin. Those are what are really remaining here. We don't really have a lot of color in here, and we've got very little tone in here. So again, in your setup for apply image, have you set the layer to low? Yeah. Have you also set the blending mode to subtract? Yeah. Have you also set the scale to 2? And the offset to 128. Yep. Then I need to come look at your image. Oh, you got a 3 opacity. That opacity needs to be 100%. All right, is everybody else okay with this? And then we're going to hit OK on this. So now what we've got, again, it doesn't look like much here. It looks like this gray thing, whatever here. But now what we've got is this is our high detail. This is our high spatial frequency information, and the low is separated down the bottom. However, this doesn't look like an image that I can work with. In order to get it to work with, we need to change the blending mode of our high layer. So click on the drop-down. It's the blending mode of the layer, which should be sitting here at the very top of your layers palette, called normal. Click on that drop-down and come all the way down to linear light. And it should look like a normal image again. To make sure to do, and this is an important step in here, you want to do a safety check on this. Hold down your shift key and click on the low layer. So now I've got both high layer and low layer are both highlighted. They're both selected. Come up to if you look across from the tab that says layers to the flyout menu, again, the little lines that are on the far right side, click on that flyout layer, and you can actually, in the flyout menu that comes out, you want to say I want to do a new group from layers. It'll be a new group from those selected layers. So select that part. You'll get an opportunity to name this, and I just call mine FS. It stands for frequency separation, and say OK. When you do that, it will put both of those layers that we just created inside a group, and the group also has an eyeball on it. And what you want to do is you want to turn the eyeball on and off and on and off. If you see a change in your image, your split did not work. You fucked something up somewhere along the line. But if it doesn't look like there's any change in here, and mine does not look like there's any change in here, we are good to go. Does that make sense to everyone? Did that work for everyone? Yeah. All right. We need to open up the frequency split layer here because we need to now do the part that nobody else does. So I don't want to claim that I invented this. I'm certain that I didn't, but I don't know anybody who uses this but me. But this will save your ass, I can't tell you how many times over. The issue that we've got right now is we're going to actually start working, and we're going to do destructive work on both the high layer and the low layer right here to do our retouching, and that part's fine. The issue is that I have always, you guys know this about me, I've always got a back door. I've always got a way to back out of something. I'm always doing something non-destructive. And the problem that we've got right now is that I went in and blurred that thing 4 pixels. That was to get my low layer. Are you going to remember that in 6 months? You'll have no idea. Now, you could type it into the low layer right here. You could type in low, did it a 4 pixel radius, because the issue is that if 6 months from now you go in and look at this image and there's something wrong and you need to change the split, you need to do it all over again, there's no way that you're going to know what that pixel layer was. You won't know what that softening, what the blur on that was. There's no way to recreate this. So that becomes a problem. If I just do the work right now, which is how 99.9% of the people in the world would do it, they would just start working on this right now, you have no way to back out of that. You have no way to undo that work. So for me, I'm going to show you how to actually make this so that you do have a way to back out of it. The first thing is to actually just select the low layer and hit Command-J. It makes a low copy of it, and that's all you need to do. We are now going to work on the low copy only, and the low one that is beneath it is our virgin. It's the one that we can actually then go back to if we make some mistake or something horribly goes wrong 6 months from now, a year from, whenever it is. We've always got the low virgin that's sitting right down here, and I can steal anything from this low virgin, bring it up into the low copy, and it will be as if I'm starting over again. Make sense? I'm going to do the same thing to the high layer, so simply click on the high layer and hit Command-J to make it a high copy. However, you'll notice when you do that, this image picks up an enormous amount of sharpness, of contrast. Has anybody in here ever used high-pass filters for sharpening? That's pretty much what is happening right here. It's that same kind of thing. It's not what we want it for, so we actually need it to be, again, this whole virgin and then working copy of this. So what we need to do is we actually need to clip this high copy to the one that's underneath it. So again, if you hover your cursor between high copy and high, hold down the Option key and click, you will actually get a clipping mask situation. We've now clipped high copy down to high. When you do this, high copy inherits the blending mode of high. High is actually set to linear light, so is high copy, so we're getting hit with it twice. You then simply need to change the blending mode of high copy back to normal. Yes? Yep. So I'm going to get rid of that altogether. So you've got low copy made, right? That's the easy one. So for high copy, just for high, select it and hit Command-J. You'll make a copy of it. Hover your cursor between the two layers. Hold down the Option key and your cursor will change to a square with a little arrow that points down. If you then click on it, you'll notice that that high copy shifted over, and it also puts a little arrow pointing down. That's telling you it's been clipped to this bottom layer right here. So anything that's going on to this layer right here impacts this layer right here. However, blending modes are also cumulative here. So because I've got high is set to linear light, High copy is actually adding another layer of linear light on top of that, and that's why this image looks so crunchy. You need to then change the blending mode of high copy from linear light back to normal, and your image now will look exactly the same. But now I can do all of my retouching on high copy and also on low copy. And again, if I run into any problem, I can always steal information from high copy and bring it up, from high and bring it up into high copy, and I'll be good. It's like a way to undo it. Yes?
Why wouldn't you just like turn off the like original layers and just like leave them in like a folder or something instead of like clipping them to each other and stuff?
Again, a lot of the cases that we do in here, this will not be our only split. We'll have a whole nother series of splits that can happen later on. So then which one is which? I get where you're going, but again, you could put notes in on the copy layers themselves and say, I blurred this low copy 4 pixels or whatever. It would allow you to reconstruct it. But this way, I'm covered and I don't screw with it. Okay, we'll see what it looks like, maybe. Now would be a good time to go to your tablet if you have one. Okay, so the tools that we then use with this. The tools that we work with are high copy layer. Pretty much, it's not exclusive, but what we're trying to do on this is replace texture. That's all we're trying to do, and we want it to be really precise. 90% of what you do on high copy is going to be done using the clone stamp tool, and a hard one at that. So that's the first thing that we're going to set up. So I'm going to go to my clone stamp tool and pick clone stamp. Make sure you're doing it, not the pattern stamp. In your drop-down menu, you want your clone stamp tool. You don't want it to be 100% hard because then you'll actually see the lines of it. But I'm going to leave mine up in sort of like the mid-80s. So that's typically where I work with mine. This is a really hard tool in here, and that's actually what I want this to be. I'm going to click on the Word Adobe to get that flyout menu to go away. You want to leave your blending mode at normal, and you want this at 100% opacity and 100% flow. You don't want to get into less flows or less opacities, because the problem with that is, going back to the conversation we had last week, is that if you use less than 100% opacity, what you end up doing is that you are taking new texture and you're putting it on top of old texture that you want to get rid of. But because you've got less than 100% opacity, it leaves some of the old texture that you're trying to remove intact, and it blends the two of them together. And so then you end up with new texture and old texture blended together, and in my opinion, you might as well just call that fucked up texture, because that's what you've got. Make sense? All right, so we're going to get rid of the little hairs that are on here. I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller to actually do this. Where you sample is important. So the things that we need to think about doing this work right now is where we are sampling is focus. So I don't want to, if you take a look at this girl's, the side of her cheek over here, the area that's getting back by her ear is radically out of focus compared to the area that is right on the top of her lip. The area that's actually even not that far over, that's down here on her lower cheek, is not anywhere near as sharp as the focus as the area that's up in here. So you cannot mix detail that is out of focus and use that to replace detail that is in focus. You need to get detail that is in focus. So I'm going to sample this area that's right up here, sort of like above her. We'll take a look at my screen. You can see it's on the lip part up here. It's actually still got texture to it. You can see, again, she doesn't have the best skin in the world, but that's not the point here. The point here is that I need to make this area down in here have the same texture as this area that does not have the small hairs in it. So I'm going to hold down my Option key, and I'm going to sample this layer that's on the top. Make sure that you are working on your high copy layer. In your layer drop-down menu here, you want to make sure that this is done to current layer only. It'll just avoid any problems that we could possibly run into. So again, I'm going to sample this color that's right up in here, and then I'm simply going to go over the area that are these hairs in here. And you can see what I'm doing. I'm going to resample again. I resample actually quite a bit just so that I don't get a repeating pattern of her skin on the side. But you can actually see as we come down in here, look at that sort of darker blemish area that was right on her lip. That is remaining there because that is low frequency. That is not high frequency. All I'm doing is getting rid of these small little hairs. That's all that's actually happening in this. I'm not changing the underneath, the shadow that's happening underneath this. I'm not getting rid of any of that part here at all. And now I've actually eliminated all of that. But you can see it didn't change this little blemish area here that's right above her top part because that part is low frequency. You cannot do this with a healing brush or a clone stamp tool on a regular image. It simply will not happen. Did this work for everyone? All right, I want to go after another area over here. It's actually this blemish that's right on the other side of her face that's sort of close to her nose. So you can see in this area as well, if you look at the area that's surrounding that, you can see that on both sides of that are skin that has texture. If you look below it on the upper part of her lip, because the upper part of her lip right in here is actually oriented to the light to give you a direct reflection on this, there's no detail in this at all. You don't see any of the texture of the skin, none of it's there. It's pretty much flat. I don't want to sample from that area and bring it up here to actually cover that blemish that's on the side of her face because this has no texture. All of a sudden you'll have texture that's next to it on both sides, and then this area right in the middle that has no texture at all. That would stand out. You don't want to do that part. So instead, I'm going to sample here from the left or from the right side of her face where I do have texture. I'm going to again hold down the Option key to get a new sample point, and I'm going to come up and I'm going to paint right over that area. And you can see it removed the texture part of that. It fixed the texture part. However, I've still got a shadow that exists there. And the shadow that exists there is in my low layer. So to fix that, you need to come down to your low copy and you need to click on this. Now for low copy, we do not want to use the clone stamp tool because it's too precise. For the low copy, what I really want to do is pick color that is the new color that I want, but I also want to blend that color with the surrounding colors. Now you remember last week when we did the cigarette burn on the girl, I said the tool that you want to use is the healing brush tool because it will replace texture. In this case, we don't need to worry about texture because we're not using texture, but then it replaces the tone around it. It mixes the tone and the color around it to make the new texture disappear or blend in. So that's what we're going to do. It's going to be the healing brush tool. So I'm not the spot healing, but the regular healing brush tool. I'm going to make mine a little bit larger. In this case, you want your healing brush tool at its default, which is a 50% hardness. Mine is. And then all I need to do, again, is I'm going to sample an area of skin out here. You don't need to worry about what I need to do is I need to get color that is close to this area right here. I don't want to use the upper part of her lip. That's not close to the color. Really, the area that I was in where I did my sample for my clone stamp tool to replace the texture is really close to what I need it to be. So I'm going to hold down the Option key, set a sample point here again on my low copy. And then again, you need to paint across the entire part of the image. This is now how you do that retouch. And look at the difference now. If we turn on the eyeball for our FS group, you can see it got rid of it and it comes back. But zoom in and take a look at that mother. And you can see the detail matches perfectly. The color matches perfectly. I don't know that I've been there. Make sense? All right, let's continue on this a little bit. She has got a pimple that's sitting right underneath her mouth on the top part of her chin. Yes?
Mine still looks like it's still super obvious. I don't know why.
All right, let's go back in history. Let's go back to where at least your clone stamp was part. So your clone stamp did the trick. It got rid of that part, right? So, but now you're down on your low copy layer, healing brush tool, not the spot healing, but healing. So click on that, make sure your spot healing right there. So you're in normal blending mode, your current layer. I don't know why you've got an angle set up in there, but yeah. And then click on your drop-down menu. Let's just see. So you're 50%. That part works. Say fine to that. Come back down to your low copy. We're going to sample a area right over here. So just hold down your option key and click on sample, and done.
Okay.
All right, so we're going to go after the, pimple, whatever the thing is on this bottom part underneath here. So again, what I'm going to do here in this part is, this has got texture in it, and I'm worried that this area on the right-hand side here doesn't have a whole lot of texture in it because, again, it's being hit by our light. It's on the light-hand side. So I'm feeling like this is a better texture sampling from the left-hand side, so that's what I'm going to go after. So back up to my high copy. I'm going to hold down the shift key, the option key, and click to sample part up in here. And then again, I'm going to, I need to do this using my clone stamp tool, not the healing brush tool. So again, sample this area over in here, and I'm going to come down through part of it. Again, you need to worry about repeating patterns, so break this up a little bit. I'm going to do another sample from a different place. And that gives me skin texture down in here, but you can see I've got a lot of red blotches that are happening in here. You can actually do this work without looking at your entire image. So if you've gone ahead and done this, I want you to go back in history. So bring that back. So I'm going to go back 2 steps in history so that whole thing comes back. If you hold down the option key and click on the eyeball for your high copy, everything else goes away, and you can actually spot your detail better here. You can not only see what you need to fix, you can also see really good places to draw your source material from. And it's even easier to see that this the skin that's over here on this side, on the right-hand side, is not going to match the area that's right here. If you take a look underneath this pimple area right here, you can see a lot of that good skin tone. So it's going to be sampled from this right side over here. So again, I'm going to hold down the option key, make sure that you're clicked on high copy and that you're working on it. And I'm going to click here to sample, working with my clone stamp tool. And again, cover this area right here. I'm going to resample another spot just to break up my pattern right here. So we can work on the high layer like that completely independent. If you hold down your option key and click on the eyeball again, it'll turn everybody else back on. And then if you turn this on and off, you'll say actually the difference. It fixed the texture, but now I need to fix the tone. You might not know how bad this tone really is in here until you hold down the option key and click on the low copy eyeball by itself. And now you can spot what the problem is right in here. You can see these little areas in here that are problematic, that have got all that sort of like red in it. You can also see the areas where you want to sample to get rid of that part. So I'm going to select the low copy, make sure that you get that layer active. It's one of the downsides to doing frequency work is you're going back and forth between high and low. If you forget to go to the proper one and you start doing your retouching on the wrong one, you're in trouble. So, but I can see the area that I need to fix right here. I'm going to hit the J key. That'll give me the healing brush tool. So, or just check healing brush tool. Make it a little bit smaller. And then again, I'm going to hold down my option key, sample some color down here. Pick the spot healing brush tool. And then simply come up here to actually get rid of those red splotches. While I'm out here, I'm going to get rid of this guy. I can actually get rid of some of these others up in here. I can smooth this part out in here. And then I can turn everybody back on. And then take a look. Turn your frequency separation on and off. I'm going to have to make sure that your original background copy is turned on so that you can see it before and after. Boom. Look at how seamless that retouching actually is. Does this make sense, everybody, what we're doing here? Is this working?
No, my blur filter
Well, you're too late in the game.
No, because I just realized it.
Was this ever blurred?
I did.
But you've already done the split. You can't change this once you've done the split.
I have the original one here.
Okay, so you can throw away your low copy. Command J to make a copy of your this guy, and this is the one you want to work on. So, but you don't want to go in and blur this image. That defeats the whole purpose. So you're going to do the healing brush tool, right? Zoom into this area so you can see it. Not that much. Good. Right there, fine. But it's easier to see just what you need to do without all the texture. So scroll up, come up to the top, turn off your high and your high copy. Just turn the eyeball off. Good, you're working on this. Can you see that little spot right there? You know that that's what you need to fix. So you're on your low layer, hold down your Option key to sample this, and then just paint across that.
Yeah, I see.
Boom, right? So it's just easier to see that. There are people who, I'm one of them, who pretty much will work only on the high layer and only on the low layer, completely independent of the other two. I don't look at the whole image as in its totality. Make sense? Especially doing this color work. Are we good on this part? All right, let me see where we're at. Okay, we're doing pretty good here. Okay, let me make sure. Okay, so you can spot where certain things are. So if we take a look at the left side of this girl's face, you'll see that there's some laugh lines that are running down in her face. And you can sort of spot where these things are. So again, if I hold down my Option key and click on the eyeball for the high copy, I can see part of it is right in here. So part of that is in detail. But if I go down to my low copy and hold down the Option key and click on that eyeball, I can see again that I've got part of this that's in, so it's in both layers. There is shadow tone that's showing that where that line is, but there's also detail defining where that line is. You've got to get both of them out. But this is what I was talking about earlier when you're actually looking at this part of it right here. When we go to determine what is going to be in my low layer and what's going to be in my high layer, you're never going to lose anything, but you can be more aggressive in your low layer and end up with less in your high layer. So it's conceivable that I could have gotten that frown line in just one and not in both. And that would be ideal if I was only retouching those laugh lines. That would be ideal because I don't want to have to do the work twice. I don't want to have to hit both layers in this. It's not that it's going to take me a long time to do it. It's just I don't want to do both of them. Does that sort of make sense to everyone? Are we good on that part? Okay, so this is one way to do your split. There's actually another way to do a split that might give you a better way of thinking about doing this. There's people who do it the way I'm showing you right now. The majority of the people that I know do it this way. However, there are other people who prefer it a different way. So in the way that we're looking at right now, what we're establishing first is the low frequency. That's what you have to pick. Then the high frequency comes after it. However, there's a way to start with the high frequency. You can go into an image and say, what do you want to keep as detail? So instead of setting the low first, we're going to set the high first. You ready for that? Okay, so to do that, I'm going to go all the way back up to the top. Not to confuse us, I'm going to go all the way back up to the top and click on what the image looked like. So my very top history state, this is what the image looked like before we did any splitting at all. So we get rid of everything. It's just like we open the image up again. So to do this, this is a high pass version of it. Again, there's a recipe that's just as detailed. So if you think you're going to save time or it's going to be easier to remember, it isn't. So I'm just going to show you how to do it and the pitfalls that you might fall into when we actually do this part. So to do this, we're going to start the same way we did. We're going to do 2 copies of this layer. So Command J, Command J. We're going to double click on the middle one. We're going to name it low again. We're going to double click on the high one and name it high. In this case, we're going to actually stay with the high layer. I'm not going to actually, this is the one I'm going to work on first, because again, I'm going to establish what I consider to be the high frequency detail that I want to keep first. So has everybody got their 3 layers set up? All right. So with the high layer active, you want to come up to the filter menu down to other, cross over to high pass. And high pass will actually open up, and I'm going to suggest you drag the radius all the way down as far as it'll go. It'll go down to a 1/10 of a pixel, and you won't see anything. So then we're going to start to drag our high pass up. So I'm going to drag it up to a number 1, and you'll actually see that detail is starting to appear. Now, I don't think that this is enough, so I'm going to drag it up to a 2. And again, the one thing I don't like about this is that, well, again, it's just how you feel comfortable in working. When I look at this, I'm saying, okay, the things that I'm looking in here, I'm going to zip back out here to just show you a couple of tricks that I look at when I do this. If you drag this radius up a lot, so I'm going to say bring this radius up to like a 10 or, yeah, even like a 20. Once you get up to a 20 right here, you see color is starting to come into this image. This is way higher than we would ever want to be. But I'm just saying, what's happening now here is we've grabbed all the detail, but now because of, again, where the spatial frequency lies, we are starting to get into bringing color and tone in this as well, which is something you would definitely want to avoid. So again, I'm going to drag it back down to my 2 or 3. So I'm going to come back down to 2. I'm going to zip in. Again, you don't want to come in too close on this. I'm at a 200% here. A lot of people would argue that you should stay at 100%. Your mileage might vary. I'm going to try a 3 again on this, and I'm feeling pretty good about the 3. I'm going to see what the 4 does for me. And this is the part that I find hard to do. It's like going back and forth between my 3 and my 4, and my 3 and my 4 here. So I'm going to go back down. I'm going to leave it at a 3. This will give us a different split series than we had with the apply image, because in the apply image one, we actually did it using a blending of 4. So here's the thing about doing high pass. You've got to remember this number. So this, whatever number you put in here, and it doesn't have to be a whole number. This could be 3.1 or 3.6. It could be any of that, or it could be 5.2, whatever it is. But whatever it is, you need to remember that exact number. My suggestion to you is that you keep a pad of paper next to your retouching and you write it down. Because if those two numbers don't, we're going to have to enter this number again. And if those two numbers don't match, your split will fail. And then you'll hate your life because you'll have to do it all over again. Are we good on this part? So I'm going to go ahead and say okay to this. This is the tricky part right now. So you need to pay attention not only to this part of the lecture, but when you're reading the recipe for this, this comes up. You need to pay attention to this part. Immediately after you do this, you need to go to the image menu, down to adjustments, and over to brightness and contrast. So again, image, adjustments, over to brightness and contrast. The only time I've ever used brightness and contrast in my life. But anyway, it'll bring up an opening dialog box. Now typically we could set this right now. However, you see this little check mark down here where it says use legacy? Watch what happens when I do this. It's a -50 in your contrast. That's the goal in all of this. So I'm going to click on this contrast slider and I'm going to drag it to the left till I get a -50. But look what happens if I click on legacy now. It zeroes that out. And if you don't know that that got zeroed out and you hit click OK, you haven't changed the contrast at all in this. And if you don't change the contrast in this, your split will be invalid. So what I typically do when I come into this is I click on Use Legacy and then I drop the contrast down to a -50. You'll notice it's a completely different range here. You can actually type these numbers in, so I'm having trouble getting that as a -50, so I'm going to just type it in by hand and say -50, and then I'm going to say OK to that. Now we actually need to change this to our blending mode of linear light. So again, this is the same as we did for the apply image version of this. So I'm going to click on my drop down and I'm going to come down and do linear light. However, now you'll notice that again, your image is hyper crunchy, and the reason it's hyper crunchy is that we now need to build the soft light layer, I mean the low frequency layer. Judith? No, you leave legacy checked. That's the whole point of going through all of that. Come down to your low layer now, make your low layer active, come up to the filter menu, down to blur, down to Gaussian blur, and you need to enter the exact same value that you entered in your high pass filter. That's why I suggested that you write it down. In our case, it was 3 pixels, and say OK to this. And then these two should be split based on your high frequency. So again, it's just what do you want to preview first? Do you want to try to actually use blurring on your low layer to get rid of the high detail? Or do you want to go in there and say, this is what I feel like should be high detail, and then the low ends up getting subtracted out of that? Does that sort of make sense? We need to do our check again, so hold down the Shift key and click so that you have both high and lower selected. Click on the menu to the right of the Layers tab to get your flyout menu and say, I want to do a new group from layers and call this FS, which stands for frequency separation, and say OK. And then again, turn that guy on and off and make sure that you've actually done and that your split is actually working. In my case, it did. It works fine. Open it back up. We are going to make our safety layers now. So click on the low layer to make it active, hit Command J to make a copy of it. You're good to go on that. Click on your high layer, hit Command J to make a copy of that. Again, we go through the exact same process that we did with the apply image version of it. Hover your cursor between the high copy and the high layer, hold down the Option key. You'll get that little icon that now looks like a square with an arrow going counterclockwise. Click, which will actually clip the high copy to the high layer. You'll see that it shuffles it over to the right and you get a little arrow that points down. And then finally change the blending mode of your high copy from linear light back to normal. And now we're able to go after the exact same thing. So I'm going to turn off my eyeball by holding down the Option key and clicking on it so I can just see my high layer. And you can see I've still got a little bit, I'm looking at that laugh line again. I've got less of the laugh line in my high layer. Now more of it is actually in my low layer than it was in our original split. There's still part of it though that's here in this high layer, so I'm going to get rid of this part first. I'm going to hit the S key to get the clone stamp tool. I'm going to hover really close to this. Again, it's this laugh line that I'm trying to get rid of. I'm going to hold down the Option key, click to sample that, and then just run it down. That will get rid of all the texture of that laugh line. And then I'm going to go to my low copy, hold down the Option key, and click on its eyeball, and I can see a much better version of that. So again, I'm going to hit the J key to go to my healing brush tool. And in this case, I don't want to sample the shadow area that's to the left of it. I want to actually sample the area that's to the right of it because I think this is a closer color of where I'm going. However, I'm making the transition. I'm going from lighter color to darker color, but that's the advantage of using the healing brush tool is the healing brush tool is then going to look at the lighter area on this side and blend it into my new color, but it's also going to look at the darker area on the opposite side, on the left side, and blend it in as well. So you should see this just disappear. It should be seamless. So I'm going to hold down my Option key, click to sample up here, click and drag down, and let go. It's a perfect blend in there. I can now turn on my high copy and layer, and the frown lines, those lines are actually gone. Again, if you want to go up and turn on your eyeball for the entire group, got to make sure that your bottom background copy is on so you have a before and after, and you can see it does an amazing job of replacing that part. Are we good on this part? Okay. If that wasn't enough, you can close this up. You do not need to save it, not part of your homework. Ooh, we actually got some time in here. This might work out well. I want to go back up to our frequency separation images again, and the next one I want you to actually open up, it's called Wrinkled Green Skirt. It's a JPEG. If you could open that guy up. If you get this warning, that's a good sign. That's telling you that your color settings are correct. If you did not get this warning, you need to raise your hand right now. If you did not get this warning, you do not have your color settings set correctly, so you need to go up to the Edit menu. Sorry, let me cancel mine. Close the image up first. Go up to the Edit menu, come down to Color Settings, In the dialog that opens up, make sure you use the drop-down menu to go from North American General Purpose 2 to North American Pre-Press 2. Make sure that this RGB is set to Adobe RGB and say OK, and then open that image again. And if you don't get the warning again, you need to let me know. Did you get the warning this time? Yeah. All right. So, how do we get rid of the wrinkles? Did you say don't know? Oh, it is going to be split frequency work. So we're going to split this relatively quick. Again, I'm going to do it the original version that we did. So Command J, 2 copies of the layer, double click on the middle one, call it low. Double click on the higher one, call it high. Turn off the eyeball for high. Select the low layer to make it active, and then I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to go into 100% here. So what I know that I do want to do here, True had it right, hit it right on the nail right on the head. What I want to make sure that I'm doing here is that I want to keep the texture of the fabric, and I want to keep the stitching of the fabric. What I want to lose, or what I want to separate, is I want the stitching and the texture of the fabric to be on my high layer, my detail layer, but I want all these wrinkles to be on the low layer, so that when I change the low layer, I don't change the texture or the fabric or the stitching part of it at all. Does that make sense to everybody where I'm going with here? I want to keep the texture of the skirt, and I want to keep the stitching of it all. Those parts I want to actually keep. So this might actually be easier to look at using the high frequency method. So let's see how that one looks. So I'm going to turn back on the eyeball of my high layer, and I'm going to select my high layer, and I'm going to zoom in even tighter on this because I want to be able to see. I'm zooming into the sort of zipper area where I can see the stitching here, but I can also see the texture of the fabric, but I can also see one of the shadows of the big wrinkled layer right here. So I can sort of see both high and low in this well right here. So I am then going to, again, with my high layer selected, I'm going to come up to the filter menu, down to Other, over to High Pass. I'm going to drag it all the way back down again, and I'm going to start at my 1, and I'm going to just start to crank this up. I'm up at a 3 right now. I've got the texture of the fabric, I can see that. I've got the stitching, but I do not have that shadow in there. I'm going to go up to a 4 and see what that looks like. I still don't have any shadow going on in there, but let's crank this up really high. I'm going to take it up to like a 20. And you can see I'm up like a 27. At 27, I start to pick in. I'm getting all of that shadow part, and I'm getting color in here as well. So you can see if you carry this too far, you get into trouble. But when I was at 4, this actually looked really solid to me. So I'm looking at 4 here right now. I'm going to zip around. I've got a little bit of wrinkling that's happening in here, but those aren't really wrinkles. Those are more folds in the fabric. I've got the same thing that's happening up in here, but those big general folds that are in it, the wavy part in it, are pretty much gone in here. So again, I'm going to remember that I had 4 pixel radius on this. I'm going to say OK to this. I'm going to immediately go to my image menu, down to the adjustments, over to brightness and contrast. I'm going to click use legacy first, and then drag my contrast slider down to a -50. I can't get the 50 in there, so I'm going to type it in with my keyboard, and I'm going to say OK to that. Change my blending mode of this from normal to linear light. Then go to my low layer here. I don't even need to look at it. I just go up to the filter menu, down to blur, down to Gaussian blur, and I'm going to put in 4 pixels. Again, the exact value that I used for my high pass, I need to use for my blur, which was 4 pixels. I'm going to say OK to that. Then I'm going to make a safety copy of my low layer by just hitting Command J. I'm going to go to my high layer now, select it because I need to make a safety copy of it as well. Command J. I need to then hover between my high copy and my high layer so that I can clip high copy to the high layer. Hold down the Option key and click. That's now clipped it down, and then finally change the blending mode of my high copy back to normal. then hold on my shift key and select the low layer. So I'm now selecting all 4 of those because I didn't make a group to begin with, but now I've got, so a high copy was active. I'm scrolling down, holding down the shift key, selecting low, so all 4 of them are selected. Then going to my flyout menu just to the right of the layers tab and say new group from layers. I'm going to name this FS, say OK. And then again, turn this on and off and make sure that there's no shift in your image. And if there's no shift in your image, you did your split correctly. So then I'm actually going to come to my try to get rid of the wrinkle parts. I'm not really concerned about the texture part, but it's the wrinkle parts here that I need to actually get rid of. So there's a number of ways that you can do this, but what most people will do here is they will actually use the mixer brush to do this. How many people in this room have ever worked with the mixer brush? What do you do with it? Mix? That would actually be clever if you just left it at that. A fucking mix. What do you do with the mixer brush? I don't know. Brush? With some mixing? Anyway, it's a tool that's in Photoshop. It was really designed, Photoshop, wants to be all things to all people, but the mixer brush came about because they wanted to emulate natural media for people who paint. So they wanted to be able to treat it like watercolors and the way watercolors would actually react. And the brushes that we have that we typically work with in Photoshop don't work that way at all. They actually either lay down color or they don't lay down color. You can do soft edges, you can do opacities and flows, you can do those sorts of things. But it's not like you're taking 2 colors of paint. It's not like you're taking 2 colors of paint on a canvas and mixing them together and getting a 3rd color. That just doesn't happen if you're working with that. However, it does happen with a mixer brush. So that's what we're going to use. However, there's really specific settings that you need to use for the mixer brush. So I'm going to open those up to show you those first so that we can follow this. Because if you don't get the mixer brush settings correct, you'll end up with a mess. So again, there's another PDF in our retouching. In not only in the folder you've got, all of these PDFs are also on our website. So if you double click on this to actually open it up, you will actually see how the brush is supposed to be set up. And I'm going to go through these one at a time because there's a bug actually in it. I don't know if they fixed it in this version of Photoshop, but in the last version of Photoshop, this didn't quite click in the way you would want it to click in. You'll also notice that there is a showing right down here of your options palette for the mixer brush. So this thing is really pretty critical to how we do this part of it. So to get to your mixer brush, back here into Photoshop, you come down, it's actually in the brush group. But if you click on the brush, it's usually at the very bottom. It's called Mixer Brush Tool. Does everybody have this tool? Does anybody not have it? Occasionally this tool will go missing, and if it goes missing, the way you get it back is you come up to the Edit menu, down to Toolbar, and this opens up, and what will end up happening is that this is your toolbar on the left-hand side. You'll have extra tools on the right-hand side, and the mixer brush will be hanging out here on the extra tool side. You simply click on it and you drag it to where it belongs in the tool group. So it'll look like this. The mixer brush will be here. Simply find the brush group here, click on it and drag it. Typically it goes at the bottom of this and it'll be right there. And then you can simply click on done and then the mixer brush will be available to you. So go ahead and pick the mixer brush tool. You'll see that things up at the very top change. The options bar changes radically. This is not what it looks like for any of the regular brushes. So the first thing that we actually pick on the drop-down menu right here is you want a complete softness on your mixer brush. Again, we're looking for very soft edges for the work that we're actually doing here. Then you can ignore the next 2 icons over, but the next one that's over, it's these 2 icons that matter, and they're not, what they are is they're actually push buttons. So if you take a look at the settings for our recipe, it's going to say uncheck the load brush after each stroke. That's this tool right here. And then check the clean brush after each stroke. That's the one that's right next to it. So in my setting, you can actually see that's how it's set up, but this preview is incorrect. So I'm going to click on the load brush after each stroke, and then I'm going to uncheck it. And now you'll see I'm right back to where I should have been, but this preview right here is now completely transparent. And that's what you want to make sure that you have. So when you talk about checked or not checked, this is supposed to look like a button that's been pushed. The first one, you'll see that there's no black around it. That means that the button hasn't been pushed in. But the second one has got this dark background around it. You'll see that that's supposed to indicate that it has been pushed in. This is how you want both of these to be. And again, if you look at my PDF, you can see this surround of this one appears to not be dark. That means it does not look like it's pushed in, whereas this one is. And again, the real key to this is you want this preview swatch right here to be transparent. And the reason we're doing this is that what we're going to use this brush to do is we want to move color, but we want the brush to clean itself after every time we move it. Because if the normal behavior of this tool is that once you load ink onto this brush, it keeps it on it. No matter where you go, it keeps it on it, and then it starts to pick up other color as you go along. This is what can cause a real mess if you're trying to use this tool the way we're going to actually try to use it. So anyway, that's how we want to keep this part right here. The wetness and the load have to do with how much ink you actually transfer out of this brush. These we keep consistent. So you want your wetness to be at 20%. We're going to use other things to control the flow and the amount of ink that really comes out on this brush. So your wetness is set to 20%. Your load is 100%. What load is that how much ink or how much color do you pick up with every stroke, and you want it to be fully loaded with every stroke. So that's what load is about. Then in terms of the mix here, we're going to leave the mix at 100%, and what that is it's saying, I want you to take the color that I'm sourcing and mix it completely with the destination color. So again, we've got source and destination. And then finally, flow. And what flow will do is control how fast this action happens. So flow is flexible, flow is variable, and you will use flow between 20 and 50%. If you're at 20%, it's going to take a lot of brush strokes to affect something. If you're at 50%, it goes much faster. You can even go higher than this. You could go up to 100% depending on how demanding your image is. But you'll see, what you don't want to have happen is you don't want things to just take off on you and all of a sudden you're like, Jesus, I've got to slow this down. That's actually controlled by flow. So I need everybody to make sure that you've got your options up here set just like this. We are going to do, again, make sure that this is transparent, the preview. This is the preview of the color that we're using. It's no longer your foreground and background colors. It's this color up here is what we're using, and we're not using any color because we're going to pick up color with every stroke. The first icon to the right is actually unchecked. The second icon is checked. You can leave this at custom because that's actually just what the brush is because we've made changes here. A wetness of 20%, a load of 100%, a mix of 100%, and I'm going to start my flow at 40%. So that's where I'm going to bring mine down to. It's pretty much a go-to for me anyway. You do want to use your tablet to actually do this work. It makes a real difference in here. All of this work happens on the low copy layer. We're going to do it, but we're going to actually do it where we can watch the high copy as well. A lot of times, I've already told you this, I'll go strictly to my low layer and only do the work on that low layer, but in this case, I'm going to do it so that we can watch this whole thing happen in real time. So then what we have to do is we need to look and see what's happening about this wrinkle that we need to get rid of it. Now, we are seeing this wrinkle because there is a slight highlight on the top side and there's a slight shadow on the lower side right here. The area that's just below the shadow part right here, this is the area that I want this shadow to actually be. It's a little bit lighter than the shadow, so what I'm ultimately going to do is I'm going to drag this color into my shadows right here. And it happens, watch my screen, I'll show you how this happens. It happens pretty much repeatedly and it happens pretty fast here. I'm going to make my brush slightly larger. And again, if you take a look at your drop down here, make sure that your brush is set to a complete softness here. That is still controlled by these drop down icons right here. You'll see that it just picked up color again on my brush right here, which it shouldn't have picked up. This is my current load. So again, I'm going to turn this on and then off again, and then it goes to transparent. This is clearly a bug. Yes?
My bracket, oh, never mind it, it's fixed.
Okay, good. So there is no sampling of color here. It's just where you start. So watch my screen. I'll show you how I'm going to do this. You just start to click and drag up here, and I'm just repeatedly clicking and dragging up, and you can see how much lighter that just got. I'm going to continue to drag up in here like this, and I've just gotten rid of that part. I'm then going to click and drag down here to get rid of this part, and then down in my lower part right here, I'm going to go after the darker part here really fast. And then I'm going to come in from this side and start to drag color back down in here. Drag up a little bit more color to open that up. Then I've got actually a highlight that's happening up in here that I'm not really thrilled about. So there's a couple of other tricks that I can do. But I'm going to take this darker area and drag it up over the highlight and just try to blend all of this out. Again, I get a little frustrated if it moves. It's moving at a pretty good speed. For you guys, probably a good speed to stay at. For me, I'm going to bump up my flow here a little bit to get it to go a little bit faster. So I'm up at around a 50 right now, and that takes care of that. And this will take care of this. And now you can see, if I turn my low copy on and off, you can actually see that I've massively removed that wrinkle part from it. So there are other tricks that we can do on this. So for instance, I've got a weird little area in here that I'm not sure I'm going to be able to paint this out using the mixer brush. So I need everybody to look up at my screen here really quickly. I'm going to hold down the Option key and turn off the eye, or click on the eyeball. It'll turn everybody else off except for my low copy. And now I can actually see areas that are going to be problematic for me. It's like this area that's right into here. Again, I can still go after this with my mixer brush and try to actually smooth that out, and that did a pretty good job of it, but I don't have any real source to go after this highlight that's right here. You can use a regular brush to paint on this as well. So to use your regular brush to paint on this as well, I'm going to go to my toolbar over here. I need to go to my brush tool. This also needs to be set up in a very specific way. You do want to make sure that this is 0% hardness, so make sure it's completely soft. You want to change the blending mode, or just make sure your blending mode is normal. 100% opacity, and then we are going to radically drag our flow down. I'm going to bring my flow down to around a 2 or 3%. What is the difference in flow and opacity?
Flow, how much comes out of your brush. Opacity is just how much of the layer you're showing.
I'm going to show you what it is right now. I need everybody to create a new synthetic layer. Command N to bring up the new dialog box, however you get to it. I'm going to change my drop-down menu from pixels to inches. I've done this with you 1,000 times. I'm going to make it 10 inches wide. I'm going to make it 8 inches tall. I'm going to do a 300 pixels per inch resolution on that, and I'm going to say OK to this. Command N, or just go to the File menu and come down to New. And just create a new blank file, so we've got something to work on. I'm going to hit the D key to default my foreground and background colors to black and white. I do still have my brush selected, but if you don't, hit the B key to get the brush, or select it in the toolbar. Not the mixer brush. This is the regular brush tool, the one at the very top. I'm going to change this to a completely hard brush. It's just easier to see, so I'm going to drag my hardness all the way up to 100%. I'm going to leave it at 100% opacity and 100% flow. I'm going to make my brush a little bit larger, so it's about the size of a little bit smaller than a penny. And I'm going to simply click and drag across the very top of my image, and that's laying down 100% opacity, 100% flow. If I then change my opacity to 50%, so I'm going to cut it down to 50%, 51's close enough. I'm going to do the same thing again on my image. and I'm going to drag across this time. And you'll notice now, do not pick your cursor up or let go of your mouse when you get to the other end. It lays down 50% of the ink, but if you come back across it here, it's not laying down anything more. No matter how long you go back and forth, as long as you don't pick your mouse up, this is never going to change. It's going to be 50% of black ink. What it's really looking at is the difference between the black and the background. And since the background is white and the black is, and the image, the ink that I'm putting down is black and the background is white, 50% right in the middle between those. If you, again, you take a look at my readout right here, I'm getting a readout of 125, so it's close enough because I hit 51% opacity, not 50, but anyway, middle gray. If I take my brush off of this, so I've lifted my cursor up off of it, or let go of your mouse, or take your finger off your trackpad, however you do it, and then actually start another stroke, you'll see that it lays down another 50% opacity. Now, a lot of people would say, well, it should have gone black. I took 50% opacity and I added 50% more to it. 50 plus 50 is 100%. But that's not how this works. What this looks at is where you're actually painting, and where I'm painting already had 50% ink on it, and comparing that to the ink that I'm trying to put down, which is black. But now it's saying there was 50% already down there. Now you are adding the in between, that 50% gray and black, and it turns out it's 75% in the middle. Then you can do this again and you can lay down another version. That is not completely black yet. You can see there's a difference between that and the top. It's now looking at that 75% black and comparing it to the 100% black and going halfway in between. And this keeps happening until finally you'll eventually get to black. That's how opacity works. If you drag opacity all the way back up to 100% now and take your flow down to 50%, actually, it's not going to work. You got to get your flow down pretty hard. So take your flow down to like a 10%, 9%, 10%. That'll work here. Now do the same trick. Go back and forth. Click and go forward, but then come back. Flow will continue. As long as you are moving, it will continue to put ink down. And as you continue to go back and forth, I've never lifted my cursor up off of this at all. It's continuing to put more and more ink down. Again, as long as I'm moving, it will continue to put ink down until I finally hit black. Now, if I hover this cursor over an area, I don't get increasing black. It does not continue to spit stuff out. You need to be moving in order to get that ink to go out. If you want it to be autopilot, like you want this to be like a true airbrush, it's this little icon right up next to flow. If you click on that, now come down and simply put your cursor down and hold it down. It will continue to spit that ink out over a period of time until you actually get to black. My suggestion to you, when you get really good using this tool, you can use the airbrush tool. I don't use opacity. I use flow for almost everything because it allows me to brush things in slowly. I don't use the airbrush tool, and I do very small flows. Does this make sense, what's going on to everyone? All right, you can close this guy up. You don't need to keep this anymore. I'm going to hit Don't Save. I am still working on my low copy. I am still looking at this area right here that's just above this sort of darker. It's this shadow that's right up in here that I want to actually fix. So again, I'm going to make sure I've got my regular brush tool selected. It is. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller. I'm going to make sure that it's completely soft brush. Mine was a completely hard brush because I was doing that demo, so it's completely soft right now. I am going to leave it at a normal blending mode, 100% opacity, and I'm going to take my flow down even more. I'm going to bring it down to like a 2 or a 3, somewhere in here. You'd be shocked at how fast this actually happens. Hold down your Option key and click on an area of this green skirt that you want this highlight to actually be. So I'm going to click on this area right out here that gives me the sample of what that color should be, and then I can simply scrub across this highlight to actually get this thing brought back to the color I want. I can still use this on the shadow area that's happening right next to it. So I'm simply scrubbing across this and then scrubbing up here. It's actually painting this color down. Now, do not be tempted to pick a single color. You need to vary your color a lot. So I'm going to resample another darker color down here and use that to come up here and blend this in. I'm going to pick another color in back down into here to try to get rid of some of the shadow. But then I'm going to go back to my mixer brush, and now I've actually got areas that, I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller, that I can, there's still a little sort of a highlight line right in between these two. I can use my mixer brush to simply bang that out, and I've gotten rid of all of that. And then I can go hog wild on this guy. I'm going to come back out. I can still see areas right in here that are a little bit lighter here than I'd actually like. So I can try to drag mixer brush across it, or I can go back to my regular brush, color sample this lighter area that's down in here, make my brush larger, and then simply scrub across all of this area to sort of pull all of that shadowy part out. I can do the same thing. Look at this whole line of wrinkles that's actually happening right down on the zipper part. I can simply scrub back and forth up and down there, and I get rid of all of those. I'm going to sample this area up in here to get rid of that highlight that's actually in the middle. Again, unlike the mixer brush, I'm not dragging anything over that. I'm going to use it also to lighten up the shadow that's up at the top. Then I am going to go back to my mixer brush and pull up highlight color from the bottom to soften up that line so that I get rid of that part so I don't see it. I can do the same thing across all of those little wrinkles. I'm going to do mixer brush across all of those little wrinkles, all of this stuff. I'm going to get rid of all of that. I'm going to come down here now and use the mixer brush to drag down the line that splits that seam. Make my brush larger. I'm actually going to bump my flow up even a little bit more. I'll go up into the 70s and hit this part because we're running out of time, but you'll see, and I'll smack that whole part out. I'm going to continue just to work my way down. This is all mixer brush. Again, make sure that you realize that what you're doing with this brush is wherever you tap first is where it's going to pick up that ink. So you don't want to tap in the areas that you're not happy with. Make my brush smaller and just run it straight down. All of those little lines, all that puckering that was running along that seam where these two actually run into each other, I've gotten rid of all of that. And take a look what this looks like in real life. If you zoom in now on all of those areas, you have not lost any texture at all. It's all still there. The texture of the fabric is there. The stitching is there. But look at the difference. This is without my oops, sorry, let me turn on my bottom background layer. Are you kidding me? How nuts is that? Right? I've still got some areas here that I could work on right here. You'll still see a little bit of shadow in here. Again, stay with my mixer brush. A little bit larger in here. You can watch this happen in real time. Smooth these out right in here. A little bit smaller. Look at this. All of the texture's there because all the texture is up on the high layer. Try doing that with a clone stamp tool. It gets even better. Check this out. I'm going to go over here to the other side. This is a completely different color. I don't need to sample a different color. My brush is loaded with nothing. I'm just going to start fixing the wrinkles that are on the other side using my mixer brush. Zoom out, bigger brush. If you've ever tried to get wrinkles out before, right now, there's a little part of you that should just be jumping up and down for joy, regardless of whether joy is into it or not. Don't take everything out. It'll look too weird. But take a lot of it out. It'll look a whole lot better. Is this making sense what's going on here? Look at the difference in this. I have just smoothed all this out. Again, if you had to do this with healing brush tool or clone stamp tool, all of that texture would be being moved with every single one of those strokes, and you would end up with nothing but a hot mess. The only way to do this other than using this method right here is to do it tonally. And how many of you want to go back to that? Are we good on this part? Does this make sense? Okay. Let's close this guy up. We do not need to save this. We're going to try, let me see, we've got 10 minutes to do this. This may get a little fast. I'm just going to show you one last example of how I would go about doing this. I haven't done this in a while, so it's going to go pretty fast. You're welcome to try. You should try this with me. I may leave you behind just to make sure I can get this part done. But I just want to show you another sort of practical application of how all of this whole split frequency part works. Are we good on that part? Okay, so the image that I'm going to work with is again, it's in the split frequency or the frequency separation images. It's one that's called, it's the very top one. It's this 2021096 underscore ccon underscore v. Anyway, this was actually done by, there was a student in my class a few years ago named Zach who actually did these images. I think they come from Comic-Con. I can't swear to that. But at any rate, if you open this image up, this is the one that I'm actually going to work on. And I'm going to open it up as a, you can open it up as a smart object. It doesn't matter. However, when we do it as a smart object, you cannot do split frequency. Well, you can actually do split frequency work. You can do the split on a smart object, but you can't do any of the retouching on a smart object, so it kind of defeats the purpose. But at any rate, what I'm really going to go after is the wrinkles of her stomach right here. Now, next week, we are going to get into a large conversation about the ethics of retouching, about body image, about all the work that people do in retouching, and is that good, bad, whatever. Anyway, like I said, read those things I've asked you to read, watch the movie that I've asked you to watch out here. So what I'm showing you here is technique. Whether you say to me, well, those wrinkles in her stomach are beautiful, I think you should keep them, I completely applaud that. If that's your feeling, that's fine. If you were to say to me, well, I want to take them out because I don't think I want them there, whatever, that's completely viable. From my point of view, I don't want this to disintegrate into a dialogue today about body image and what retouchers are doing for the benefit or the hindrance of body image. That's a conversation to have next week. Is everybody cool with that part? What I want you to know about any of this is that I am completely sensitive to all of those issues, and I don't want to offend anyone. This is technique. Are we cool with this? Okay. So my challenge is to get this part out, and this is going to be, again, a pretty difficult thing to actually do, but I'm going to try to do this using split frequency. However, I'm going to start with a major part of it first that really isn't about split frequency at all. It's just going to be a quick way to deal with parts of this. So I'm going to go ahead and just rasterize this image just so that I don't have to deal with the smart object issue in this. So again, I'm going to do one new layer right now. So I'm just going to hit Command J. This is actually going to be pixel retouching. This is going to happen before my split. Then I'm going to grab the pen tool and rebuild this line. So I'm actually going to take it right here, and I'm going to bring this in to give myself a new line on here. I've missed this edge right in here, so I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that, and I'm going to pick up this edge right here, and then continue right down to here. So I've got a selection of this area. I'm going to go ahead and load this as a selection. I'm going to double click on it first and just leave it called Path 1. Command click on the eyeball to load this as a selection. I am going to feather it because, again, it'll be way too sharp. It'll look like I've cut it out. Select down to modify, down to feather, and I'll throw in a 1 pixel feather on this and say OK to that. And then I'm in on this pixel retouch layer. Now I am going to use the clone stamp tool, the S key. Now remember, the selection is going to control where this can actually work and where it can't work. I need to continue these stripes that are happening, that whatever is in this background. So I'm going to sample outside the background right here and bring this in right here and click and then bring the whole thing in, and it should allow me to actually get rid of that part of it altogether. Command D to deselect. So this has been my first move, is to simply give her a line right there. But again, the waste that I'm dealing with, all the rest of this part is going to screw me up. So at this part, I'm going to treat this pixel retouching as my new virgin, and I'm going to do 2 layers on top of that. Command J to actually do it. This is going to be my new split. I'm going to call this low. I'm going to double click on the top one and call it high. I'm going to turn off high, come down to low, and I'm going to blur it. And again, I'm going to drop down to, you never really ever are going to go not unless you've got a really small image between down below like a 2 or something. However, I don't feel like I've got really good detail here, so I'm going to look at someplace else on her image, probably her face, to really look at detail in here. I'm going to go to like a 3. 3 is getting pretty blurry in this guy. Take a look down here again. And I feel like I've lost all sense of texture and skin here, so whatever. So I'm going to leave this as a 3.0 and say OK to that. Go to my high layer, turn it on, up to the image menu, down to apply image. Select my low layer. Again, subtract. All of this stuff stays sticky between restarts of Photoshop, and I'm just going to say OK to that. I'm going to make a copy of my low layer, Command J, just as my protection. My high layer, I'm actually going to change it to linear light and make a copy of it, Command J. Clip the 2. Change my high copy now from linear light back up to normal. And then I can start to work on this. The first thing I'm going to do is hold down my Option key to turn on just the eyeball for the high. I want to get rid of these really solid lines that I've picked up right here. So again, it's the clone stamp tool, the S key. I'm just make sure that this is set up correctly. Really hard one. It is correct. Everything else in here will work. That should be 0 on the angle of this guy. And then again, make my clone stamp tool a little bit smaller. I'm going to start on this edge right here so that I can actually keep the edge. So hold down the Option key, click to set the edge, come up and click there, and that will actually take care of that part. I'm going to do the same thing coming down from the top. I'm going to click here and come down to continue that part, and then hit it again. All I'm doing is I'm trying to make sure that these lines have set up correctly on there. I can now turn my low layer back on, and this is the area, this is what I've actually got going on right here. So now I can see the area that I need to fix in here, this mismatch of tone. I need to actually fix that part of it. So I'm only going to work on my low layer to do it. And you can sort of see now what the challenge in this is ultimately going to be. So I am going to go to my healing brush tool. Occasionally, because I've got to keep this really hard line right here, I might go to my clone stamp tool. I might do that part. However, I've got a path that's already got this selection of this edge has already been made. So I'm going to load my path. That loads that edge. And then I'm going to change my selection from this area that will only allow me to work inside of here to the inverse of this. And now I've got a marching answer going around the outside. Now I can actually do this kind of work right here. This edge is going to be protected. Does that make sense to everybody? So watch what happens if I do this. I'm going to go back to my low layer right here. I'm on my low copy right here. I'm going to do it with my clone stamp tool just so that you can see it. The S key, I'm going to sample out here. But as I start to push into here to do this, all of this area in here is protected. And since it was based on the edge that I made, that edge is lining up perfectly. Does that make sense, everyone? Okay, I'm going to hit undo to actually undo that. You don't want to actually use the clone stamp tool. You want to use the healing brush tool. So I'm going to sample, I hit the J key to get the healing brush tool, and I'm going to sample from right here. And I'm simply going to come over here and try to get rid of the really heavy parts of this. I'm going to sample down here and sort of bring up into here. Come down here again and sample up into here to get rid of this part in here. Maybe hit this, Command Z, down here a little bit more to get this in. No, that brought in too much tone in there. I don't want that part, so Command Z to undo that. Then I'm going to go after my mixer brush right here, and we'll see what we can get on this. So, mixer brush, make it much smaller. First thing I'm going to do is try to soften up all of these lines in here. So again, it's set up exactly the way I want to do it. I'm going to drop the flow back down to 40–50%, somewhere in there, and I'm going to just start blending this out. And I'm going to blend this out as well. And I'm getting rid of a lot of that texture and tone and line. However, this area right in here needs to be considerably lightened up, and I don't really have any source for the mixer brush to do that with. So again, I'm going to go back to my regular brush, hold down the make it smaller, make sure that it is still completely soft. Again, I've got that 4% flow on this. I'm going to sample a color of her sort of lighter skin right here and just start to work on this part. Again, I can go back and forth across this pretty quick to try to get that line out. And that lightens that part up. I can actually put in a little bit darker in here. This part down here needs to be lightened up, although I think my flow is too strong, so I'm going to take it down to a 1 so that I can really control this. It's almost like I'm dodging and burning this out. So go back to my mixer brush and bring in a little bit of this area right in here across this part and up. And hit Command D to deselect, turn everybody back on, double click the hand, zoom in just a little bit. I know. I did that in 7 minutes. And I would still clean it up a little bit more. There's still a little bit of shadow in here. But check this out. Are you kidding me? I even leave in part of the little wrinkly part right here. You see it's sort of like a little something in the skin because it makes it believable. But that's how fast this is. And again, all the texture, show me where the texture of the skin changed anywhere. It didn't. It's the same here as it is all around this. I never worried about that part. Guys, this is a fucking game changer. I know. Of all the things that I can show you, this is actually, well, there's a number of things, but this is a biggie. Are we good on this part? Okay, so just to show you your homework assignment really quickly, and then we're out of here. So your assignment, I need to show this to you. If you want to look at it, there's 2 versions of this file in your assignment folder. There's a TIFF version and a JPEG version. The TIFF version you've actually already started to work on. If you take a look at the assignment, what it says to do is you're going to knock out the image, you're going to remove the spill, you're going to add a white background, and then you are going to completely retouch this girl based on the retouching notes. This small JPEG is the retouching notes. So if we open both of these up, do what? Again, the one you've already separated it out and removed the spill and put it on a white background. That's where you should start unless you want to do it all over again just for practice. So this part's important. Do not ignore this. These are the retouching notes. So again, you're to clean up the eyebrows, you're to balance the skin tone. So again, look at these colors right here. You can see there's a red blotch right here surrounded by all this green. All of that needs to get smoothed out. See this big hunk of missing hair in here? You're to fill all of that patch in. You're to get rid of all the blemishes. I have not pointed out every blemish. This should be enough information to know that that means you need to get rid of this, you know, the other blemishes that are around as well. You're to remove the contact lenses. You see this little shadow in here? Those are contact lenses. You're to actually soften the area that are underneath the eyes right here. You're to even out all the skin tone. You'll see it's a much darker area right in here, followed by a lighter one, followed by a darker one. You're to remove the little hairs right here. You're to remove the stray hairs that are going wild. These, like this is a stray eyelash that's shooting down here. You're supposed to get rid of that part as well. You're to remove the hair on her upper lip. You're to remove the laugh lines in here. Fix the lip. That does not mean get rid of all the texture. That means simply get rid of these little bits of lip that are flaking right here. Remember, if you remove highlights entirely from this, you make her a dead girl. Same thing goes for the catch lights in her eyes. If you remove those, girl's dead. Don't do that. But the final challenge on this, and the biggie on this, again, remove this little hair that's over here. The biggie on this is that you can see she's missing a tooth here. Look at this side. See that tooth? It doesn't exist on this side over here. You need to fill in. You need to fix the missing tooth. And when it says fix teeth here, it means you need to uncross her front teeth and balance them out. Are we good on this? I'll see you guys next week. Oh, there's also a thing down here. See how much her neck has got a lot of cyan. It's very different in the color. You need to balance the color of her neck so it matches the rest of her face. And I'll see you guys next week.
Hey, Mercer.
Yeah.